Hi, you guys. I want to try to clear up some of the confusion with the arthrokinematics of the hip for you before you start studying too hard for the exam. In class, I believe we said for open chain hip flexion, it was a posterior roll, anterior glide. That's true. Some of the other ways to name it are also true. And let me just explain why I stopped focusing on it, because it is really too confusing. It's not too confusing, but let me try to explain it for you. How you name the roll and glide really depends on what point on the femoral head you're picking as the reference point, right? If I pick this point here as my reference point, and you picture the femur moving into flexion, which would be the femur moving this way, right? As the femur moves this way, this head is going to roll in this direction. If I pick this as my reference point, this is rolling posteriorly, and then it's going to roll inferiorly, right? If I pick this point as my reference point, it's first going to roll superior, then posterior, then inferior. Okay, so the direction of the roll really is dependent on where in the range of motion you are and where you're picking your reference point on the femoral head to name it from. Generally, we tend to pick the center of the femoral head to name the direction, but the naming of the roll and the glide is really kind of subjective and dependent on where in the range you are. Okay, so this is why it gets so confusing. So if I reference here and I say this is rolling posteriorly, then yes, it actually ends up being an anterior glide, right? But if the hip is already in, let's say, 70 degrees of hip flexion, right, then the glide actually becomes inferior. So the naming becomes very dependent on where you are in the range of motion. If I'm going to ask you a question about what the arthrokinematics of the hip are, open chain flexion, we will stick with posterior glide, posterior roll, anterior glide. I could also ask you if the hip is limited into hip flexion, in what direction would you mobilize? Right? We don't tend to mobilize the roll. Okay? So I don't mobilize the roll. I tend to mobilize for the glide. Once the hip has moved into even 30, 40 degrees of hip flexion, then the glide is pretty much always inferior. Okay? So once the hip is in 30 degrees of flexion, the glide becomes inferior. That's what we're going to go with. So this is what I want you to study. Study what I say on this podcast, right? Little recording. Honestly, when you are mobilizing in the clinic, you take the joint to the end of its available range, and if that's 40 degrees or if it's 50 degrees, the mobilization is into the direction of the limitation, and you feel the limitation. So you need to understand the arthrokinematics to give you a place to start, but the way the joint feels is going to help you decide where you actually mobilize, what direction you actually mobilize in. Okay, and that's just too much for you to be able to determine at this point. Okay, so because you haven't felt it, you haven't felt these limitations. So I hope this didn't confuse you further. If it did, I apologize, but I think it should at least give you an idea of how I might test you on this. Okay, goodbye.